In 43 years of intelligence work, I had filed reports on 912 species. I knew the Vreth, their war doctrine, their pressure points, the precise chemical signature of their fear response. I knew the Okhari collective, every diplomatic front, every false flag, every buried atrocity they called policy. I had mapped the collapse of 3 civilizations from the inside. I had predicted 2 more before they fell. My assessments had never been wrong, not once. In 43 years, my supervisor called it a gift. My enemies called it something else. I called it preparation. I had read every file. I had studied every species the galaxy had produced. The apex predators, the hive minds, the ancient ones who moved through deep space the way water moves through stone. I thought I had seen everything. I was wrong. Her file was 42 pages. 42. The Vreth file was 9,411. The Okhari required 3 separate volumes. Even the Gren Shock, a species we had only confirmed contact with 6 years prior, already had 230 pages of documented behavioral patterns. The human file was 42 pages. I almost set it aside. I almost moved on to the next briefing, the next species, the next appointment in an endless calendar of threats I understood completely. I almost did. What stopped me was a single line, buried on page 3. Written not by one of our senior analysts, but by a Valari field officer named Met. 31 years ago, in a notation so brief it barely qualified as a footnote. They do not surrender. They adapt, and the next time you encounter them, you will not recognize what they have become. 31 years ago, a footnote. I read it 4 times. Then I closed every other file on my desk, and I started reading from the beginning. The file had a structure I recognized. Field observations, diplomatic records, biological assessments, resource capability estimates. The standard architecture of an intelligence brief, the same framework I had used for 912 other species, but the contents were wrong. Not inaccurate, not falsified. Wrong in a way I had never encountered before in 43 years of reading files. The biological section was competent, bipedal, bilateral symmetry, relatively fragile construction, no natural armor, no significant physical augmentation, pain response highly sensitive compared to galactic averages. Lifespan, brief. Reproductive rate, moderate, nothing exceptional. And then the notation beside it. In direct physical conflict with species possessing superior strength, speed, and environmental tolerance, humans have demonstrated an anomalous win rate. Current models cannot explain this adequately. Recommend further study, cannot explain. I set the page down. In 43 years, I had never read those words in an intelligence file. We do not write, cannot explain. We write insufficient data. We write conflicting accounts unverified. We do not write, cannot explain. That is not a phrase that belongs in formal assessment. It is a phrase that belongs in private notes. In the kind of notation you make at the end of a long day when something has unsettled you and you do not yet know why. Met had written cannot explain. I turned the page. The cultural section was thinner than I expected. 2,200 distinct cultural groups documented. High internal conflict rate. They had spent the majority of their recorded history fighting each other. Wars over territory, wars over resources, wars over ideology. Wars over things our analysts had translated but could not fully categorize. And then a line that stopped me completely. Despite centuries of internal conflict, humans demonstrate a consistent pattern. External threat produces rapid internal consolidation. The speed of this consolidation does not correlate with the severity of the threat. Small provocations have produced disproportionate unification responses. The mechanism is not fully understood. Not fully understood. Twice now. In 22 pages. I had read files on species that unified under external threat before. It was not unusual. Fear was a reliable consolidating force across most sapient biology. What was unusual was the speed, and what was more unusual was the disproportionate response. A small threat, a large unification, that was not fear. Fear calibrates. Fear is proportional. You gather enough force to address the threat and no more, because surplus response costs resources you may need later. What Saw Met was describing was not fear. I did not yet have a word for what it was. I turned to the resource capability section. 3 pages. The Vreth resource section alone was 412 pages. 3 pages. Saw Met had written a single annotation at the bottom of the last one. Note: human resource capability estimates have proven consistently unreliable. Initial assessments have been revised upward following every documented conflict. Recommend treating all current figures as minimums, not maximums. Minimums, not maximums. I closed the file. I sat in my office, the same office where I had filed reports on 912 species, where I had predicted the fall of 3 civilizations, where I had never once written the words "cannot explain," and I sat very still for a long time. Then I opened the file again, and I went back to page 3. They do not surrender. They adapt, and the next time you encounter them, you will not recognize what they have become. 31 years ago, a field officer named Saw Met had sat somewhere, a forward post, a docking station, a temporary outpost on the edge of known space, and had watched something happen that unsettled him enough to write that sentence. I wanted to know what he had seen. The file did not say. There were 12 documented first contact incidents in the file, 12 times the Valaria Accord, or its predecessor organizations, or independent species operating without coordination, had made initial contact with humanity. 12 separate moments when the galaxy had looked at this small blue planet and decided to introduce itself. I read all 12. The first 4 were peaceful. Trade agreements, preliminary diplomatic exchanges, the kind of careful protocol-driven contact that most species prefer at the beginning. Low stakes, low exposure, an opportunity to observe before committing. The humans had been curious, cautious, occasionally suspicious in ways our analysts had noted as unusual. They asked more questions about intent than most species at similar developmental stages. Not about technology, not about resources, about intent. Why are you here? One of the first recorded questions from a human diplomatic representative. Not what do you want? That comes later when trust has been partially established, not what can you offer. That comes even later when the relationship has economic dimension. Why are you here? In 43 years, I had read first contact records for hundreds of species. I had never seen that question appear first. I noted it and moved on. The 5th contact was different. A species called the Grethari, extinct now, but significant in their time, had made contact in what our records describe as a resource claim assertion. Standard procedure for the Grethari. They were an expansionist species with a well-documented acquisition protocol. Arrive, assess, claim, negotiate from a position of demonstrated strength. They had done it successfully with 11 other species before the humans. The humans did not negotiate. The file is sparse on details. But what Saw Met had compiled from secondary sources and recovered Grethari records painted a picture I read twice to make sure I was understanding it correctly. The Grethari had arrived with 3 vessels, more than sufficient for a resource claim assertion against a species at humanity's technological level at the time. They had issued a formal territorial declaration. They had given the humans a response window of 30 days. On day 7, humanity responded. Not with a counter-proposal, not with a request for negotiation, not with the standard suite of diplomatic signals that every species in our archive had used at this stage. They responded by destroying one of the 3 vessels. A single strike, precise, surgical. And then, nothing. No follow-up, no declaration, no demands. The Grethari records described the silence afterward as more alarming than the attack. They withdrew. The file notes this outcome without analysis. Saw Met's annotation reads simply, "This pattern recurs. See contacts 7, 9, and 11. I turned to contact 7, different species, different technological context, similar outcome. Contact 9, different region of space, different political structure, similar outcome. Contact 11, the most recent documented incident before the file was compiled. The most sophisticated aggressor. The most lopsided technological disparity. Similar outcome. I set the file down for the second time. There was a pattern here that I was not yet able to name. Not aggression. The humans had not initiated any of these conflicts. Not defense in the conventional sense. Their responses were disproportionate, asymmetric, designed not merely to repel, but to communicate something. I thought about the Okhari, the 7 days of silence before the strike, the single vessel, the stillness afterward. They had not destroyed all 3 ships. They had destroyed one. Precisely one. That was a message. I had been reading it wrong for 23 pages. They had not been responding to the threat. They had been defining the terms. I finished the file at 0400 in the morning. I know the exact time because I noted it in my personal log. Old habit. 43 years of noting the time of completion for every major intelligence review. A small discipline. The kind of thing you do so that later, when you are trying to reconstruct the shape of a decision, you have fixed points to work from. 0400. I sat with the closed file for a long time. Outside my office, the station was quiet. The summit did not begin for another 11 hours. The human delegation had arrived the previous afternoon. I had reviewed the manifest, as I review all delegation manifests as a matter of routine. Standard diplomatic party. 4 representatives, 2 support staff, 1 security attaché. And her. She was not listed as the lead delegate. She was listed 4th, which in most species diplomatic protocol would indicate a secondary or advisory role. But Met had filed 1 additional observation, 22 years after his original notation, a brief supplementary note I had almost missed. The human designated as cultural liaison operates differently from standard diplomatic personnel. She does not negotiate, she observes. In 3 prior summits, she has said almost nothing during formal proceedings. The other delegations have consistently underestimated her as a result. I do not believe this is accidental. I had read that note at 02 unseen. I had been thinking about it for nearly 2 hours. At 0412, I made a decision I had never made in 43 years of intelligence work. I went to find her. Not as part of the summit. Not in any official capacity. Before the proceedings. Before the formal introductions and the scripted positions and the careful language that everyone uses when they know they are being recorded. I went to find her directly. Old habit, reversed. I had always believed that the most valuable information came from files, from records, from the accumulated documentation of behavior over time. I had built a career on the principle that what a species had done was a more reliable guide than what any individual within that species would say. I still believed that. But the file had 42 pages, and every page had a notation that said cannot explain, or not fully understood, or recommend treating as minimum. I found her in the observation deck. She was alone, standing at the viewport, looking out at the star field with an expression I could not read. She had a book with her, physical, printed, the kind of artifact that most species had abandoned for data formats centuries ago. She was holding it loosely at her side, not reading it, just holding it. She heard me approach. She did not turn around immediately. She waited 3-4 seconds, and then she turned, and she looked at me with the particular quality of attention that Met had described and that I now recognized immediately. Not hostile, not guarded, not the careful diplomatic neutrality that most representatives affect when meeting an intelligence analyst before a summit. Just present. Fully, entirely present, the way very few people ever are. You read the file, she said. It was not a question. I did, I said. All of it? All of it. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked back at the stars. Old habit, she said. Preparation, I said. She almost smiled. Not quite. Same thing, she said. We ended up in the station canteen. I am not certain how. These things have a momentum of their own. The observation deck was not the right place for a conversation, and neither of us suggested moving, and then somehow we were moving, and then we were sitting across from each other at a small table in an otherwise empty room. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the table for a moment. What was it? She said. In the file. What made you come find me? I considered the question carefully. The annotations, Adsis, I said. There were 14 instances of cannot explain across a 42-page document. That is not a documentation style, that is a pattern. She nodded slowly. Saw Met, she said. You knew him? I knew of him. He filed a report about my grandmother actually 40 years ago. She looked up. She was at the Vithara border incident. He was observing. I had read that report. I had not made the connection. He was a good analyst, I said. He was scared, she said. That's what makes a good analyst. The ones who aren't scared miss things. I looked at her. What are you scared of? I asked. It was not a question I would normally ask, but she had established a particular quality to this conversation. Direct, unguarded, and I found myself operating within it. She thought about it seriously, not performing thought, actually thinking. Stopping, she said. Stopping what? Anything. She turned the cup in her hands. The cost of stopping is always higher than the cost of continuing. Even when continuing is hard, even when it seems like stopping would be easier. She paused. Humans know this in a way that I don't think translates well into file entries. I thought about the Grathari, the 7 days, the single ship. The file documents a pattern of asymmetric response, I said, disproportionate reaction to provocation. Analysts have struggled to model the decision threshold. Because they're modeling it as a response, she said. I waited. It isn't a response, she said. It's a refusal. There's a difference. She set down the cup. A response has a target. You respond to a specific threat in a specific way. A refusal doesn't have a target. It has a direction. You refuse to go backward. Whatever happens next, you refuse to go backward. She looked at me directly. That's not a decision threshold. That's a ceiling. A ceiling. Every species has one, a point they won't go past. A thing they won't accept. For most species, it's biological. Survival instinct, resource scarcity, something that triggers a hard stop. She was quiet for a moment. For humans, it's different. How? Every species I have studied, she said, is defined by what it will not lose. I did not speak. The question I should have been asking, she continued, and I understood with sudden clarity that this was not a spontaneous observation, but something she had been carrying for a long time. The question no file in your archive has ever asked is not what a human will fight for. She met my eyes. It is what a human will not survive the loss of. The canteen was very quiet. Because that is where the ceiling is, she said. And once you know where their ceiling is, you understand something that 4 centuries of contact has failed to record. She picked up the cup again. The ceiling is not a limit. She looked at me. It is a direction. I sat with that for a long time. Finally, I said, the file has 42 pages. I know, she said. It should be longer. She almost smiled. This time it reached her eyes. So am I, she said, still learning. The summit lasted 3 days. I attended every session. I filed my assessments at the end of each one. Standard practice, the same discipline I had maintained for 43 years. I documented the positions taken, the language used, the moments of tension and resolution, the small tells that experienced diplomats try to hide and experienced analysts are paid to notice. I documented all of it, but something had shifted in my methodology, and I was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in pressure. Not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable. I was watching differently. She was at the far end of the table, 4th position, advisory role, officially peripheral. She said almost nothing across 3 days of negotiation. She sat with the book. She listened. Senior Commander Yeth Oran of the Keth delegation noticed her on the 2nd day. I saw the moment it happened. A small thing, she had turned a page, and the sound in the silence of a procedural pause had drawn his attention, and he had looked at her, and she had looked back at him with that quality of complete presence, and something had passed between them that I catalogued and could not immediately classify. On the 3rd day, during the vote on the resource corridor proposal, the item that 3 separate modeling teams had projected would fail, Yeth Oran changed his delegation's position. It was not a dramatic moment. He simply announced a revised stance, in the careful diplomatic language that obscures as much as it reveals. And the vote passed. I watched her when the announcement came. She did not react. She turned another page. I found her afterward in the docking bay. The human delegation was third to last to depart. Another small indignity of positioning they had accepted without comment. She was standing slightly apart from her colleagues, watching the bay operations with that same quality of attention she brought to everything. I approached. "The vote," I said. "Yeth Oran, what did you say to him?" She considered for a moment. "Nothing," she said. I waited. "I showed him something," she said, "in the book." "What?" "A page." She held it out to me. I looked at the page. It was a record. Old, the paper had the texture of significant age, a list of names, a date. A location I recognized as a conflict site from the fourth contact incident, 112 years ago. "The Keth were there," she said quietly. "Yeth Oran's grandfather commanded the opposing force. It's not in any file your organization holds." I looked up at her. "How did you know?" "Old habit," she said, and this time she smiled. Preparation. I went back to my office that evening and opened a new file. Not a formal assessment, a personal record, the kind I had kept quietly for 43 years. I wrote for a long time. At the end, I wrote a single notation. In 43 years of intelligence work, I have filed reports on 913 species. I have predicted the rise and fall of governments, the outcomes of conflicts, the trajectories of civilizations across centuries. My assessments have never been wrong. Not once. I paused. I was wrong about the humans. I paused again. Not because the file was incomplete. The file was incomplete. But that was not the error. The error was that I read the file looking for what they were. I should have read it looking for what they refused to stop being. The 42 pages are not a summary, they are a warning. I am adding this notation to the file. I recommend that every analyst in this organization read it before any contact, diplomatic or otherwise, with this species. Not because it will tell you what they will do, but because it will remind you of something important. The ceiling is not a limit, it is a direction, and they are still climbing. I sealed the file, 43 pages now. I thought of Sormet, a field officer somewhere on the edge of known space, 31 years ago, writing a footnote that nobody read. They do not surrender. They adapt, and the next time you encounter them, you will not recognize what they have become. He had been scared. He had been right. I added one final line to my notation. He was a good analyst. Then I closed the file, and I started the next one.